Hello everyone, it's Friday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. G7 summit kicked off in Hiroshima, Japan, the city devastated by a nuclear bomb one August morning in 1945 at the end of World War II. The war in Ukraine and China's aggression towards Taiwan will be key items on the agenda, with Fumio Kishida also pushing for a nuclear weapons pledge. This year, holding the presidency, Japan invited 8 countries, including South Korea, marking 4th time Seoul is taking part in the summit. And as planned, President Yoon is to meet with Biden and Kishida on the sidelines of the summit. What are details of the G7 summit and how are China and North Korea reacting to it? For this, we have invited Hans Schattle, professor of Yonsei University, into the studio. Professor Schattle, welcome to the show.
Hi, Bo-kyung. Nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
Nice to see you. And we also have Ramon Pacheco Pardo, professor at King's College, through Skype. Good to see you, Professor Pacheco Pardo.
Thanks for having me.
All right, first question to our Professor Schattle. Let's first talk about the key items on the agenda for the G7 summit. What are they and what significance does this year's summit have?
Well, for sure, Bo-kyung, the location of Hiroshima is very much symbolic, I think, because questions of war and peace, past and present, will be very much on the minds, I think, of the participants this time, especially with the news just today that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is going to make his way to the summit in person, not just to be there online. So that's interesting that, and keep in mind that until 2014, Russia's Vladimir Putin would have been present at the summit instead of Volodymyr Zelensky. So in a sense, that switch from Russia to Ukraine, at least for this one G7 summit, with it being the G7 now instead of the G8, is very significant in itself. And as you said, geostrategic concerns about the continued war in Ukraine, about the potential for conflict in this part of the world involving China. That, of course, would bring in the U.S. as well, because there's been so much talk about the kind of decoupling that we're seeing between the U.S. and China in the global economy. So how to manage that without falling into a conflict that could either be a small war in this part of the world or something perhaps much more cataclysmic. I think the location of Hiroshima will be a good place for the leaders to reflect on that. And then a couple of other economic issues that won't be lost on them either. One will be this problem with debt ceiling looming in the U.S., that the U.S. now has a tight window to avoid defaulting on its debts and to raise the limit of that. I think that will probably be worked out. It'll probably be discussed at the summit to a degree, and Biden might even have an announcement at the summit before going home to Washington about this, even something that he works out with the Congress on that. So a lot of issues in both political economy and international security at hand this weekend.
Right, symbolic and meaningful in many ways. Right, Professor Pacheco Pardo, President Yoon has been invited to the summit as well, and he is already in Japan with a scheduled summit with many other nations, including Australia and Vietnam. Now, in what areas do you believe Seoul can highlight its presence at the summit, and what does it mean to have such successive bilateral talks with other nations amid global challenges the world is facing right now?
Well, first of all, Korea has been invited to these summits more recently for various reasons, but a very important one is, of course, economic security and technology as well. So I think there will be keen interest to hear more from President Yoon about the policies that Korea is pursuing in semiconductors, of course, AI, electric batteries, and all these new technologies that are central to the global economy, and in which we see the U.S. pressing for decoupling, but no other country really keen on decoupling. They may want to engage in dialogue with the U.S., invest in the U.S., but I think there's a different view. So I think other leaders will want to hear from Korea how it sees its economic relationship with the U.S., but also, of course, with China. And I think increasingly with this discussion about how Russia's invasion of Ukraine may have an impact on Northeast Asia, especially, of course, on relations between China and Taiwan, I think there will also be interest from other leaders to hear from President Yoon what are his thoughts and Korea's thoughts about what we're calling a potential Taiwan contingency. What type of contribution may Korea make, especially in light of his contribution to Ukraine's war against Russia. And one last point that I think may come up is, of course, we're going to see hopefully the trilateral meeting between Korea, the US, and Japan. I think there's going to be interest from other countries to understand how this relationship is evolving, because in my view, right now, this is the strongest trilateral relationship that the US has in the whole of the Indo-Pacific region.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Schattle, actually, discussions about the possibility of South Korea being included as one of the members of G7 is actually emerging. And recently, the Federation of Korean Industries released a report showing that national competitiveness ranking of South Korea has emerged as the 6th best in the world, demonstrating a comparable level to G7 nations. Now, how would you assess the chances of this happening, and what contributions could South Korea make?
Right. This is such an interesting question, Bo-kyung, especially with President Yoon being invited this time, along with several other countries in the region. Of course, we have Vietnam going, Australia's going, Indonesia and India are going. So President Yoon's not the only leader who will be on the sidelines in a sense, in some respects, in collaboration, discussions with the people at the G7. I guess I'd emphasize two things. One, the G7 is not exactly a formal, legal, international organization. It's really more of a club of the world's biggest and richest industrial democracies. It goes back, as you might know, to the 1970s. It first started as 6 countries in the aftermath of the oil crisis of the 1970s, when great inflation and slowdown in the economy at that time brought the industrial democracies together to try to figure out how to regroup. And it started as mainly a transatlantic organization. Japan was the only East Asian country that was part of it, still is. So in a sense, there's kind of like 2 levels of discussion as to whether the members of the G7 might take on another country. One is whether they're ready to shift to the center of gravity away from transatlantic dialogue and much more to the Asia-Pacific region, give Japan some partners over here. Is Japan ready to have some partners? That, in the back of my mind, that also may be what the leaders of Japan and South Korea are thinking about when they, do all the diplomacy and try to get these relationships repaired, in a sense, that we've seen this past year. So I don't know if G7's been in the back of, President Yoon or Prime Minister Kishida's minds, but they may be thinking about that. In terms of criteria, that's the other side of it. If the G7's going to take on a new member, they will want to justify it to their global audience that this new member or a couple of new members, would meet some sort of criteria. And a big one is actually gross domestic product per capita. And I'm not sure if that's what the FKI highlighted. But what's interesting there is Korea's getting close. From what I can see anyway, the gross domestic product per person basically for Korea is now equal to about $35,000 US. It's lower than the current members of the G7, but it's within striking distance now for Italy. The one that's closest to it would be Italy's GDP per capita, which is about $40,000. So they could make a case that they are getting close. And if the G7 wanted to become the G8, I think Korea certainly would be a prospect in that regard. Although there are other contenders too. We could have a G9 or a G10, or we could end up with a G7 if the players just decide to keep the status quo and have the guests, on the sidelines a little more frequently. We'll have to see.
Right, we'll have to see. Now, Professor Pacheco Pardo, moving on to reactions from North Korea. Just 2 days before G7 summit began, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un inspected the regime's first military reconnaissance satellite and reportedly gave the green light for the next action plan. It seems the launch could be imminent. If it is launched successfully, what would it mean, and when would this come along?
Well, I think at this point, North Korea has made clear that it is going to continue development of its missile program, nuclear program, and of course a potential satellite launch would be linked to this as well. I don't think it would be directly related to the G7 per se. North Korea has been conducting tests over the past year and a half or so continuously. And yes, sometimes they have coincided, for example, with the joint military drills that Korea and the US have been conducted, but sometimes they haven't. And I think it's the same with the G7. In the past, when tests were less frequent, missile tests, of course also nuclear tests, there may have been some political messaging as well, but I don't know if at this point that's the main goal that Korea has in mind. I think the main goal seems to be to actually be able to develop its capabilities to an extent where it feels safe from what it considers to be the threat coming from the US and also, of course, from South Korea. So I think if there is any launch coming up, or when the next launch happens, rather, because we know there will be launches and we know a satellite launch is very likely, highly likely, then I think we should focus more on what North Korea is trying to achieve in terms of capabilities rather than the political messaging per se. The political messaging has been clear for a long period of time. At this point in time, there is no dialogue between the two Koreas, never mind between the US and North Korea, and neither the US nor South Korea are going to change the policy towards North Korea because of the launch of a satellite or even because of a new missile launch.
Right, I see your point. Now, Professor Schattle, shifting gears to trilateral cooperation between Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington here, they are already working on sharing the information about North Korea's missile threats in real time. Now, what tangible results or agreements could we expect from the trilateral summit scheduled for this Sunday?
Right. The key word we keep hearing, Bo-kyung, is strategic cooperation with shared challenges. And clearly the shared challenge most immediately seems to be North Korea.
Right.
And, the ongoing series of missile launches, elevated missile launches that we've really been witnessing over the past couple of years. So apparently, and this was reported in Japanese media this past week before other outlets, but it seems like it's unfolding that for a time, for the past few years, while South Korea and Japan have not exactly been the best of friends, they've been sharing information, in a sense, indirectly through the United States.
Right.
And now they are positioning themselves, if what we're hearing is indeed confirmed, perhaps this weekend, perhaps later than that, they'll be sharing information on radar directly now. So when you've got people in the military in South Korea and people in the military in Japan, watching for unusual activity and responding if necessary and raising alert levels and so forth, they'll be able to communicate a little bit more directly now as these kinds of circumstances are unfolding, perhaps. What we're hearing in the press reports anyway, the reporters that seem to have closest access to all of this, is that they might not necessarily seal the deal on this at the G7. They could, but the ink on this might actually be kind of set dry once we go to another summit this summer in June, I believe, in Singapore, the Shangri-La Summit. And that might be the venue. President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida are apparently going to be meeting again there, and they might work out the details between now and then, but we shall see. It sounds like at the very least the two leaders might have something to say about it at this weekend's summit. We shall see. One other thing I would raise, back to the location of the G7 in Hiroshima, I think this is also very significant in terms of repairing the relations between the Republic of Korea and Japan, because the leaders will be visiting several key sites in Hiroshima, and President Yoon, as has been reported, will be going with Prime Minister Kishida to a memorial site commemorating the lives of 30,000 Koreans that were killed in the atomic bombing back in 1945. So that's another opportunity, I think, for the two leaders to reflect and try to make some comments that would further national reconciliation here. And President Yoon, even after the Kishida visit here in Seoul earlier this month, even though Prime Minister Kishida expressed his, in a sense, sympathy for families and really, in a sense, the entire country that was affected by forced labor practices in Japan, his pointing out that his heart ached. I think in public opinion it seems something short of a full apology. It seems something short of what the Korean public on balance was looking for. So if there's every time now that I think Yoon and Kishida get together, people will be asking, will there be steps forward on reconciliation? I'm wondering again if visiting Hiroshima will open up some sort of opportunity for the two leaders to say something that could at least generate more public support for this ongoing rapprochement between South Korea and Japan. If we didn't see it in Seoul fully earlier this month, I'm not sure we'll see it in Hiroshima. but every step certainly invites another opportunity for that.
Right, I know what you mean, and let's take a look at it. We'll see. Now, Professor Pacheco Pardo, we cannot leave out discussions over Russia and China. G7 summit is expected to be a stage to show unity against China and Russia. And first of all, the G7 nations are aiming to send a signal to China by announcing a joint effort to counter Beijing's economic coercion and also emphasize peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. How do you believe discussions over China will develop?
Well, I think it's going to be quite interesting because on the one hand you have the G7 countries, you also have Korea and Australia that have taken a certain position on China, which is closer to the US view. We have seen, for example, the recent joint statement between Presidents Yoon and Biden after the summit in Washington, in which they included a strong wording about the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, economic coercion. But on the other hand, in this particular G7 meeting, you have countries that don't share this view about China. Vietnam, for example, Brazil as well, they don't necessarily share this view about China. So it will be interesting to see what the wording of the statement that is issued by the G7 is, and potential appendix or other statement focusing on economic coercion, and who signs that agreement. For example, when Korea attended the G7 summit in the UK a couple of years ago, there was a joint statement on open societies, and Australia, India, and Korea itself joined the G7 countries in signing this statement, and this was widely perceived to be a statement that was targeting both China and Russia. So I think the calculus here is different because, as I said, some countries don't share the view that the US and the G7 countries have towards China. And it will also be interesting to see whether the focus is specifically on economic coercion, or, as you were indicating, there are also going to be a mention, for example, of the Taiwan Strait, or there may be mention, for example, of countries respecting the sovereignty of other countries, which certainly would be a direct reference to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also China's potential actions towards Taiwan. It seems to me from the news that we are getting that this is not settled yet, that this will only be settled really during the summit itself, when the leaders can sit down with each other and they decide what each country is willing to sign up to.
Right, we'll have to see. Now, Professor Schattle, meanwhile, leaders of Central Asia gathered in China on Thursday and Friday, sealing pledges of enduring friendship. This overlaps with a meeting of G7 summit. What does the China-Central Asia summit suggest?
Well, it seems to suggest that China wanted to have its own party, too, right at the same time that the G7 would be meeting, that they, too, want to be seen as having friends and partners and allies, and I think China also wants to portray itself as having relationships of consequence in the global economy. And from their point of view, it worked for them to invite these 5 countries from Central Asia. Kazakhstan was the largest of them. Kazakhstan and China trade about $30 billion a year. That's the size of their relationship. I guess it's about the equivalent of about $80 billion a year. So fairly small compared to the relationships among the G7 countries. But nevertheless, what's interesting about it, I think, is that China also here has, former Soviet republics also with the meeting. And in a sense, it almost suggests that if the world is in the middle of dividing right now, with the world's democracies on the one side and the world's most industrialized countries on the one side, with the world's emerging market economies in many cases that are not necessarily going to be democracies, although several of the Central Asian republics actually do try to put forward models of constitutional democracy. In some ways, they're kind of in between democracy and authoritarianism. So it's an interesting state of affairs in geopolitics, I think, that we have these different kinds of summits going on at the same time. It reminds me also of the way that China is working very hard right now to try to cultivate relationships with countries in the Middle East and in Africa. And this was this summit over the past few days was yet another example of that, where China is saying, in a sense, to the rest of the world, we're trying to lead our version of global order as well.
I see. Now, Professor Pacheco Pardo, we are running out of time, but I want to ask this question. Russia, too, is one of the key items on the agenda, of course, and just before we began our segment, U.S. and Britain announced fresh sanctions against Russia, targeting Russian diamonds and going after entities helping Moscow. With the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky set to attend the summit in person, how is this discussion over Russia expected to develop?
Well, I think this is a very significant step because we have countries attending this particular G7 summit that don't agree with the approach that the US, the European Union, are taking towards Russia, which of course is being supported by countries such as Korea, Japan, or Australia. India, for example, has been very clear that it considers this to be a European conflict, not a global conflict. But now here there are reports that Ukrainian leader Zelensky, the president, is going to be physically present in the summit, and he's going to be able to talk directly to leaders of some countries that don't agree with this approach of imposing sanctions on Russia, that have taken a more neutral approach towards Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I think this is going to be a very important occasion for Ukraine to raise its views about why they should be receiving the support that they're getting from the G7 countries, and as I mentioned before, others such as the European Union or Korea itself. I would expect that the G7 statement will include a condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I don't think Zelensky can be invited to Japan and then lose face by not having this included in the statement. But the wording is going to be interesting. Is the wording going to be focused on criticism of Russia only? If there's going to be a call for the two sides, Ukraine and Russia, to sit down and negotiate a peace deal, this is actually going to matter. I also do think that the fact that you have countries imposing sanctions on Russia, all meeting together, because EU leaders also attend the G7 summit, I think that's probably going to help to have more discussions about what the steps might these countries be willing to take to impose further sanctions on Russia, because we know the sanctions announced by the US, by the European Union, are not the latest package. There are going to be more packages coming up in future weeks and months.
Right, I see. It will be truly a significant moment for Ukraine indeed. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition, but thank you, Professor Schattle and Professor Pacheco Pardo, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us, Bokyung.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be next Monday with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the weekend, and goodbye.